Gu Xing stared at his young daughter playing on the floor, his eyes glinting with greed. He swallowed quietly, hands trembling as he clutched his twitching stomach. "Daddy, here." His daughter, Meng Meng, noticing his contorted face, ran over with a candied hawthorn skewer, holding it up to his mouth with a giggle. "Daddy, you want to eat this too, right?" The sweet aroma hit him hard, and Gu Xing took a deep breath, eyes closed. He roughly pushed Meng Meng away, ignoring her cries as he slammed the door shut behind him. His wife's angry voice echoed from inside. "Gu Xing, that's your own daughter. What's wrong with you?" Taking in the fresh air outside, Gu Xing sighed deeply, the trembling in his body gradually subsiding. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and leaned against the window of the small high-rise, contemplating his troubles. Gu Xing's rise to success was nothing short of legendary. In just 3 years, he went from being a marketing manager at a second-rate domestic company to becoming a vice president at a prestigious international firm. Everyone who mentioned him would give a thumbs up, saying, "Impressive." His meteoric rise began with a chance event 3 years ago. 3 years ago, the second-rate company where Gu Xing worked suddenly received an invitation to collaborate from the renowned FIA Corporation. It was said that FIA was among the world's top 500 companies, with its president listed on the Forbes rich list. Companies partnering with FIA reportedly reaped countless benefits. The company buzzed with gossip for a week. As one of the marketing managers, Gu Xing was particularly excited about this opportunity. Securing this collaboration would elevate his career. Clenching his fist, he silently vowed, "This is my big break." However, the next day, his superior dejectedly informed him that FIA had chosen another company to work with. The news hit Gu Xing like a bucket of cold water, dousing his high hopes. "That's impossible," he spat through gritted teeth. His superior shook his head, patted Gu Xing's shoulder without a word, and reluctantly went to report to the president. Gu Xing refused to give up. He couldn't afford to. He had unfulfilled ambitions. He wanted to buy a large villa, enroll his daughter in the best school, taste exotic cuisines from around the world, and more. If the deal fell through, he would lose everything. Consumed by his desperate thoughts, Gu Xing frantically searched for information before driving out. When he came to his senses, he found himself standing outside FIA's China headquarters. Confused, he looked around the spacious, bright lobby, unable to fathom how he had arrived there. A sweet voice from the receptionist interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Gu, Mr. Zong will see you in his office now." Startled, Gu Xing realized he had made an appointment. But when? In a daze, he followed the secretary up the elevator to the president's office. At the door, he slapped his face hard, forcing a natural, sincere smile before greeting Zhang Wei with a firm handshake. Their conversation lasted over an hour, with negotiations proving tough. Yet, every time Gu Xing considered giving up, a fiery determination surged within him, driving him to continue haggling with Zhang Wei. When the collaboration was finally secured, Zhang Wei, impressed, patted his shoulder and offered him a job. "Young man, you've got talent, courage, and persistence. I think you need a bigger platform." Thus, Gu Xing successfully brokered the deal between the two companies and then resigned from his old job to join FIA as a marketing manager. However, he couldn't recall several key moments of his negotiation with Zhang Wei. It felt as if his consciousness had intermittently drifted in and out. All he remembered was the fervor pushing him to clinch the deal and the dizzying speed at which his brain had worked. Now, he had become one of the vice presidents of FIA China, highly valued by Zhang Wei, and was one of the strongest contenders for the next president. Gu Xing looked down from the corridor window and sighed deeply. Undeniably, over these past 3 years, that intense feeling had been immensely beneficial to him. Whenever a project encountered difficulties, this feeling would propel him forward, leading him straight to victory. In fact, many ideas would zhangguo his mind only briefly. If he missed the moment, he would never reach that height. However, this intense feeling had also caused him considerable trouble. After one negotiation, he invited the developers to a Western restaurant. When the top-tier foie gras was served, his eyes lit up greedily. He instinctively grabbed the knife and fork, devouring 17 plates in one go, under the stunned gaze of the clients. When he came to his senses, he realized he hadn't even exchanged pleasantries or had the pre-dinner drinks. At the time, his secretary awkwardly explained, President Gu was on site for several hours today and didn't eat. His stomach can't handle hunger. Although the clients found it strange, they didn't hold it against him due to Fia's strong reputation. In reality, only Gu Xing knew that there was nothing wrong with his stomach. Once, he even swallowed a 1-inch-long fishbone, and his stomach remained unscathed. But that uncontrollable hunger and urgency when seeing rare and attractive food haunted his actions. 6 months ago, a large company wanted to establish a partnership with Fia. However, according to the secretary's investigation, this company had a hidden high pollution department. Signing a contract would inevitably implicate Fia in the future. He knew it was a ticking time bomb, but when he saw the other party offering a 20% above market rate, he couldn't control himself. It was as if a beast roared within him. This is a big deal. The profits are unimaginable. He resisted, trembling, but couldn't let go of the contract in his hand. In the end, he slowly signed his name on the contract and concealed the company's pollution issue. As a reward, that company gave him a small villa in the suburbs. But he lost his previous obsession with villas and never lived there. This matter almost became a demon in his heart. His secretary once joked, President Gu is usually friendly, but his gaze becomes piercing like a sword during critical moments, making people afraid to look directly at him. His entire demeanor changes, becoming highly aggressive. Any inexperienced girl would instantly fall for him. At that moment, he felt a chill. This wasn't him. Absolutely not. Gu Xing began to feel terrified. He reviewed all the documents he had signed over the past 2.5 years and found many deals that violated his principles, yet he had agreed to them. What shocked him even more was that he had managed to make timely remedies for each problematic project, ensuring that when issues arose, neither he nor the company would be affected. That day, he collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by terror. In the past 6 months, that uncontrollable consciousness assaulted him more frequently. He began to pursue exotic foods obsessively. The rarer and more unique, the deeper his craving. Many times, he found himself sitting in unfamiliar places, surrounded by empty dishes. He could tolerate this, considering it the price of success, and he did satisfy his culinary desires, after all. However, something horrifying happened. One day, his colleagues discussed a recent news story about a wealthy person eating babies for health reasons. He expected to feel disgusted as usual, but instead, he found himself wanting to try it. Worse, Zong Wei, who had been listening, burst into laughter and mentioned the human meat buns in water margin, noting that he had heard human flesh was quite tasty. That day, he left the company in a daze, his entire body wrapped in a gnawing hunger, his stomach churning, making his legs weak. This discomfort peaked when he passed by a kindergarten. Through the iron gate, he watched the plump, laughing children, uncontrollably swallowing saliva, his hands trembling with excitement. He knew his body had developed an interest in young children. Now, he didn't dare get close to children at all. The sweet scent emanating from them made it nearly impossible to suppress his wicked greed. Gu Xing leaned against the glass window, pulling out a business card he had received a few days ago. He stared at the words Jiao Pawn Shop on it, lost in thought. He had received the card from a middle-aged man in traditional Chinese clothing during one of his frenzied dining sprees at a restaurant. The man introduced himself as Baian, the owner of the Jiao Pawn Shop, specializing in solving peculiar and difficult problems, claiming he could alleviate Gu Xing's troubles. However, Gu Xing would have to rely on himself afterward. There would be no more mysterious assistance. At that time, Baian flicked the cup of water in front of him, his eyes deep and intense as he said slowly, "Some things seem accidental, but they are inevitable. Every cause has its effect. Think about it carefully." After Baian left, the steam from the cup gradually formed the image of a fierce beast, silently but ferociously roaring at Gu Xing. Gu Xing jolted awake, suddenly losing his appetite for the delicacies in front of him. When he got home, he did think through all the strange things that had happened to him before his transformation. The only thing that lingered in his mind was a peculiar purple pearl. 3 years ago, his company had organized a trip to the seaside for the employees. Guxing and some close colleagues pooled their money for a feast at a seafood restaurant. Each person had a plate of oysters. When Guxing picked up the oyster meat, his whole body shuddered because he saw a crystal-clear, smooth purple pearl inside. He sneaked a glance at his colleagues, who were busy eating, and his heart raced. Though he usually prided himself on his integrity, he was suddenly overwhelmed by a desire to possess it. Feigning nonchalance, he ate the oyster meat and hid the pearl in his cheek. Then he excused himself to the restroom. As he stood up, his body froze. Where was the pearl? He hurried to the restroom, pried open his mouth in front of the mirror, and inspected every corner, but the pearl was gone. Had he swallowed it? He made a quick excuse to his colleagues and shakily hailed a taxi to the nearest hospital. The X-ray relieved and frustrated him simultaneously. There was no foreign object in his stomach. Everything was normal. Baffled, he returned to the hotel, unable to enjoy any food for the next few days, his mind fixated on that strange purple pearl. On the last night of the trip, a king crab as large as a small dining table was served. Guxing's stomach, which hadn't properly been fed in days, suddenly twisted with hunger. His mouth watered uncontrollably, and he was overcome with an urgent need to eat. By the time he regained his senses, he had devoured half the king crab. His colleagues stared in shock, glancing at the few bites of crab on their plates and then at the mound of crab shells in front of Guxing, nervously swallowing and joking. "You seemed unwell the past few days. We thought you had travel sickness. Now that we're leaving, you're performing exceptionally." Guxing's face burned with embarrassment, wishing he could bury himself in the pile of shells. At the time, he dismissed these incidents as unrelated, but now he realized that everything had changed since he swallowed the purple pearl. To remove the pearl, Guxing felt a sense of reluctance. After all, he had reaped substantial benefits in the past 3 years. But he glanced at the tightly shut door of his home inside. Even a tiger wouldn't eat its own cubs. Could he become a monster who would bite his own daughter? The next afternoon, Guxing lay on a bamboo recliner in the Jiao pawn shop, letting Bai An hypnotize him. Bai An observed him with great interest, muttering to himself, "Such greed, he's already nurtured the Taotai pearl to this extent." Legend had it that Taotai, a descendant of Jinyun, was insatiably greedy, lusting after gourmet food and wealth, and when starving, it would even devour its own body. The purple pearl Guxing had accidentally swallowed was none other than the Taotai pearl, embodying the greed of Taotai. Greed could be a driving force for the host, but at critical moments, it became a taboo that crossed boundaries. Everyone has desires. Some crave power, others lust for beauty. Guxing happened to crave gourmet food and wealth. Bai An placed one hand over his own chest and the other on Guxing's chest. Slowly, the purple pearl emerged from Guxing's chest. Amidst the hazy mist, the pearl gleamed with a captivating purple light, so dazzling that an ordinary person would be mesmerized at first glance. However, the Taotai pearl, which used to be the size of a marble, had now grown to the size of a fist. Bai An's hand trembled suddenly, and he looked at Guxing in surprise. Despite being nourished by greed for so long, the Taotai pearl surprisingly lacked much dark energy. Instead, it radiated even more brilliance than before. "This is the Taotai pearl." Suddenly, another person entered the small room. The glowing treasure light illuminated the face of none other than Zong Wei. Zhang Wei greedily scanned the Taotai pearl, licking his lips and chuckling, "It's perfect for my Pixiu pearl." Legend has it that Pixiu only eats and never expels, making it the favorite of merchants. Zhang Wei revered Pixiu to the extreme. His study, bedroom, and living room were all adorned with Pixiu statues, and even the Thea Company logo was a fierce Pixiu. Bai An was silent for a moment before suddenly asking him, "You said Mr. Gu's mind was controlled by the Taotai pearl and asked me to help remove it. Was it truly for his sake? Or, of course, I wanted it." Zhang Wei laughed heartily, snatching the Taotai pearl and swallowing it in one gulp. From the moment he first saw Gu Xing, Zhang Wei knew this person had also been aided by a mysterious pearl. This normally gentle and diligent man had the audacity to negotiate with him head-on, not yielding an inch. That unstoppable spirit made Zhang Wei certain that there was something peculiar about him. Sure enough, after drawing Gu Xing closer and observing him under his watchful eye, Zhang Wei slowly uncovered the secret. This small marketing manager possessed the Taotai pearl. For a Pixiu, once something is consumed, how could it be expelled? To Zhang Wei, Gu Xing within Fia was like a dish ready to be devoured at any moment. He patiently waited for Gu Xing to nurture the Taotai pearl to grow bigger and bigger, until one day, he subtly brought up the topic of the delicacy of human flesh, and Gu Xing, unable to resist, revealed an intense look of longing. In the days that followed, Gu Xing was on the brink of collapse. Zhang Wei only needed to hint to the Jiao pawnshop, and Bayan, realizing the severity of the problem, rushed over to purify the Taotai pearl. Zhang Wei didn't actually know much about the origins of the Jiao pawnshop. He just knew that Mr. Bai had helped him with feng shui a few times and dealt with some strange issues for his business partners, which led to their acquaintance. To Zhang Wei's surprise, Bayan didn't stop him from swallowing the Taotai pearl. He merely watched coldly, as if the Taotai pearl was worthless in his eyes. But it didn't matter. It was over, and he was the victor. Zhang Wei turned to Gu Xing with disdain, saying, "Without the Taotai pearl, he's just a worthless small-time player who's content with little wealth and has no ambition. Let's just put him in a cushy job to retire." Suddenly, Zhang Wei, who was filled with ambition, clutched his chest, his face turning pale, and he screamed hoarsely, "My Pixiu pearl. I can't feel it anymore." Zhang Wei tore open his shirt with trembling hands, his disbelief evident as he frantically rubbed his chest. He seemed to realize something, and his fingers reached into his throat, vomiting out a large mass of undigested food. There was no Pixiu pearl. He looked up, breathing heavily, and stared at Bayan accusingly. "What have you done?" "Survival of the fittest." Bayan glanced at him indifferently, calmly stating, "It's simply a matter of devouring each other. It seems your Pixiu pearl has been swallowed." "Impossible." Zhang Wei instinctively retorted, but after feeling it carefully, he had to admit the cruel reality. He suddenly went mad. "How is it possible? I've nurtured it for 7 years. Yet it's defeated by a mere Taotai pearl?" Bayan sneered and continued to shield his own chest with one hand while exerting force to extract the Taotai pearl from within Zhang Wei. He explained, "You only know that the Taotai is greedy, but you don't understand that greed differs from person to person. Gu Xing believes in righteous wealth, acquiring it with integrity. He is greedy, but his greed lies in his daughter's happiness and growth, his wife's health and well-being, and his elder's longevity. Everything he does is governed by emotions and principles. The Taotai acts according to the host's nature. Even when controlled by the Taotai pearl, Gu Xing subconsciously adheres to his principles. For example, with the polluted company, his proposed cooperation plan was for Fia to provide funds for the company's rectification. Cooperation would only begin after the pollution was addressed. And regarding that villa, Gu Xing later allocated enough money from his own assets to pay the other party. He simply didn't know at first and later fell into fear, lacking the energy to deal with personal finances. "Mr. Zhang, can you do this? Evil cannot overpower good. Your nature is dark, so your Pixiu pearl, nurtured for 7 years, can only lose to Gu Xing's Taotai pearl nurtured for 3 years." As he spoke, Bayan's fingers had already spun around the Taotai pearl, dispelling the dark aura entwined around it. Then, he flipped his wrist, and the Taotai pearl returned to Gu Xing's chest. Zhang Wei watched all of this in horror, and he asked in a trembling voice, Who are you?" "The bearer of the Bishi pearl," Bayan replied calmly. "Legend has it that among the 9 sons of the dragon, Bishi is one of them. He is just and upright, speaks out for justice, discerns right from wrong, and administers impartially. The bearer of the Bishi pearl naturally upholds a fair heart." Bayan leaned down and whispered softly in the unconscious Gu Xing's ear, "Mr. Gu, You are the true Taotai bearer. The Taotai Pearl has officially acknowledged you as its master today. There will be no more loss of control. I hope you can continue to uphold your principles and greed without malice.